I'm John Albin. I've been doing Drupal development since 2004, React development since 2017. And relative to this session, there's a utility that connects to Next.js, which is a React framework, with Drupal. And I'm the maintainer that converted it to the new app router, which supports server-side rendering. So, server-side rendering. If Drupal can already do server-side rendering, why are we trying to get React to do server-side rendering? PHP rendered on the server. Why are we doing JavaScript rendered on the server? It turns out this is a very, very old idea. Why are we duplicating it? It's actually older than this. There's this thing called HTML on the server, which is even older. And it's blazingly fast. It can render your pages in 0 milliseconds. Because there are already files on the server, right? Ideally, we want to have our content available as fast as possible, and that means we want to have a static HTML, ideally. But we also need to have dynamic content. We're no longer in the age of only .html files on the server. So we'd still need to render something. But when do we do that rendering? React has traditionally been rendering HTML in the browser on the client side. But with React.js version 19, which is a pre-release, they've introduced this thing called React Server Components and React Client Components. And it's a little bit tricky for React because they usually don't have anything to do with bundlers, but when you're building a React app, you're always using a bundler, whether you're using Webpack or Rollup or whatever. That's the thing that's actually taking the React and bundling it into these little JavaScript component or JavaScript bundles, the files then that get served to your web browser. So React was like, how do we do this to work with all of these different bundlers? And they created an API that's in this pre-release for React Server Components, React Client Components, and then they're allowing these different frameworks, different bundlers to implement the API for their particular scenario. And Next.js version 15, which is an official release, so if you use Next.js in your React app, it will, in the background, be using React.js version 19, which is a pre-release. So an official Next.js release uses a pre-release version of React in order to do these React components. That's what's going on here. And the feature of Next.js that uses React Server Components and Client Components is called the app router. In order to just understand the app router and this whole high-level idea of how things get rendered, where they're getting rendered, let's go through some terminology so we're all on the same page. We all know what a URL is. A path is just the part after the server name, right? So this is the path of a URL. Path segments are just basically each of these little bits. So like blog is a segment, DrupalCons is a segment, Singapore is a segment. A route. In Next.js, we talk about routes a lot, and that is literally what is the file inside your app that will render a particular path. So here, app/blog/DrupalCon/Singapore/page.js will render, this URL. Okay. And then we also have a thing in the app router called a dynamic route. And this is when we don't know the particular path segment we're going to be using when we're creating the application. It's something that we're getting from our content, from our CMS, right? And this is not just like a syntax that I put up on the screen. This is literally a folder with a square bracket, segment, end square bracket. That's the folder name, okay? And what will happen then is that we'll query the CMS to figure out what those paths should be, and then we'll know which URLs we need to render using this particular file. The magic syntax in Next.js is actually just the square brackets. That's what it's looking for. It doesn't care about the name segment. It's looking for those square brackets in the directory name. So you can create one that's blog slash square brackets category, square brackets title slash page.js. And then the last type of dynamic route is a catch-all dynamic route, which just puts a ... in the directory name inside those square brackets. So the directory name is open square bracket ... segment close square bracket. And the magic is the ... and the square brackets, and the word inside their segment, in this case, doesn't matter. You can use whatever you want. That's what I'm showing here with the category and title. Whatever you want, you can use that name. Okay. So those are our terminologies. We're going to be using them a lot in a lot of these slides. So path segments are the parts of the path. Routes is the full file path inside our app. Dynamic routes are using these square brackets, right? And you replace parts of those path segments with these square bracket directory names. Let's start comparing technologies so you understand how React version 19 server components compares to everything else. Let's go all the way back, HTML on the server. This was just static. These are just big HTML files with small bits of JavaScript, and the client JavaScript just renders a minimal amount of HTML, right? So like if you had some JavaScript that renders something about the user, you can sort of dynamically load that and render that HTML in the browser. And then this is the build step for HTML on the server. It's just us writing all these HTML files. Drupal has a very similar build step. That's all of us Drupal developers. But then we just place Drupal on the server. And then there's a single index.php that is always run for any path that's requested. So per path, we will dynamically determine what HTML needs to be rendered and then serve that HTML to the client. And again, the client is just doing a little bit of JavaScript and rendering on the client for particular things that it wants to do there. React version 18, client only. This is the traditional way that React runs, right? You have a build step, and it's the bundler. It's trying to figure out how do I minimize the size of the JavaScript files, and it usually creates like this little teeny index.html file with like a single div that just says React app goes here. Like that's what it's creating at the build step. And then you're serving statically per route. So every route will have an index.html with some JavaScript bundled with it. But then in the client, the JavaScript is rendering all of the HTML. The reason why we went down this whole rabbit hole of React was that it was nice to be using JavaScript as our one language. Instead of having multiple languages, we no longer had to have PHP and JavaScript and CSS and now we can just have JavaScript running and building our HTML. That was quite nice. But people realized that this could get kind of slow. You're serving a single div, an empty div, and then rendering the HTML in the browser. This can be slow. So they invented this thing called React rehydration. And the build step and the serve step are the build step looks the same, but what it's actually doing is it's looking at per path. It tries to get the data from your CMS at the build step and then generate a bunch of HTML files. But it still has to re-render all the HTML on the client again. So it will bundle the same JavaScript that it would have bundled in this previous line. But now it's including a static version of all of that content. So you're served a static version of the HTML, and then it sort of rehydrates. That's what it's called. It replaces, sort of swaps out the static version with this sort of dynamically rendered one that has all of the React goodiness. Faster from a performance standpoint, like you see the page load faster, but it's actually even more stuff is being downloaded to the browser now. React 19 server components solves a bunch of these problems. The build step is querying the database. It's querying, it's querying Drupal, right, to get all the content per path. So for every URL that Drupal says, hey, I've got some content at this URL, it will generate an HTML file. And then instead of this giant JavaScript where it has to re-render the entire HTML, now the only JavaScript that gets bundled with that rendered HTML is just the client components, which are the bits of JavaScript that do the behaviors. So like click handlers, that is the JavaScript that gets bundled with it. And re-rendering the re-rendering the HTML is not always necessary. So there's a whole bunch of HTML that never needs to be re-rendered. And that will make our bundle or our file sizes much better. Our JavaScript is going to be smaller. So we're saving HTML per path, and there's JavaScript per route, and then there's a minimal amount of HTML that gets rendered in the client. This is much better. How many people are using Next.js right now with like the pages router? A couple hands, okay. So the good news is that you can migrate from pages router to the app router, but you can do it per route. You don't have to migrate your entire application at once. You just pick one of your routes in the pages router and you convert it, and literally you're moving it from a pages folder to an app folder, and you're converting just that route. And the application can continue to work while in this mixed environment where some of your routes are being rendered in pages router and some of them are being routed in the app router. That's nice. It's designed this way. So this is what a typical app router looks like. This is the folder directories inside an app. And let's go to, so inside our app, I'm going to jump all the way down to the last line here, page.js. That's the home page. So any directory that has a page.js file in it, that means that that directory is a route. It's a path on our site. So /admin has a page.js. It's going to be a route that renders to /path on our URLs. /admin/settings has a page.js. It's a route. It's a path. And then we remember these dynamic routes. Blog and then something. Blog/something is a route. And we have to query inside this page.js to figure out what are all of these paths that we actually need to render, and then render them for every single path. So anytime there's a page.js, that means that's a route. Here's a paragraph component. It has an index.js. This is typically the way a lot of people create React components. Next.js's app router will completely ignore this because it does not have a page.js in it, which means you can include like utility functions and components inside the app directory and not worry that that Next.js is going to do something with it. It's just going to ignore it. It's only looking for these page.js and a couple other files. Go over this super quick since we got started late. These are the magic file names. Inside your directories, these are the special file names. If you use one of these, they do something in particular. The page.js defines the route. It also does the rendering. It's responsible for telling Next.js what are all the different specific paths for a dynamic route. It's responsible for querying and getting the content, and then Next.js will take its output and render that to a static HTML file. This is how all of these different magic names conceptually get put together inside React. So if you have a layout.js, it is basically a wrapper component around our page.js. This is the main content, right? And so if you have a layout.js, this is a great place to put, for example, a nav bar, right? And the layout.js is of these files is the one that's special, because if a particular directory does not have a layout.js, it will look in its parent directory and keep looking until it finds a layout.js and then use that. And the other thing that makes it special is that you can nest layouts. So if your root directory, your app directory, has a layout.js, that's the layout for the entire app. And if a subdirectory has a layout, that subdirectory's layout will be nested inside the app's layout file. So you have nested layouts that way. I'm not going to talk about template. That's where it goes. If you ever get thrown an error inside a React app, you want to have a friendly error page, you would write that in error.js and it would show the error here. If an error occurs anywhere inside the child of this error boundary, it'll render the error.js file. We're going to talk about suspense fallback shortly. For if the particular page isn't found, and this can happen for a couple of different reasons. The not found.js will be rendered as an error, right? And then again, our page.js is rendering as that page component in the middle of this this component hierarchy. So let's talk about how do we actually figure out what the paths are for a particular route. So defining dynamic routes on the server. So if we've got this file that's app/blog/DrupalCon/ square brackets segment / page.js. Inside there's a Next.js function that we want to create called generate static params. And we export it, and it needs to be an async function. Next.js will expect it to be an async function, so you need to define it that way and export it. And when Next.js sees that inside a page.js, it goes, oh, okay, that's how I'm going to be generating all of the different values, possible values for this path segment. And you can use any async function here. For example, you can read data from a file, like a markdown file or whatever, Excel file, CSV, read data from a database, query JSON API, right? And you can use Next.js's implementation of fetch API. So this page.js during this step is being run on the server, is not running in the web browser. So normal web APIs are not available, but Next.js has implemented a copy of the fetch API to make it easy for developers to go, oh, how do I, query an endpoint? Well, you just use the same fetch API. Next.js is providing a copy of that fetch API that is being run on the server. And then you can also use, there's this utility called Next Drupal that is a helper between Drupal's JSON API. That's also another thing that you can do at this spot in this generate static params. And the thing that you need to return then is an array of all the possible path segments, right? Since we wrote our file name as square bracket segment, it's expecting an object with that word here, that same keyword. This keyword has to be, this is the key inside our object. So it's an array of objects, and the key is this directory name. And then we just tell it, well, there's one path that is Singapore, there's one that's Atlanta, there's one that's Vienna. So it's going to say, I'm just returning a static list, but you would want to query a real thing. But this is the format that the return data. Next.js is going to be expecting an array of objects with keys that match the segment path. Let's do another example to make this a little bit more obvious. So app, blog, category, title. Now we've got two dynamic path segments. We've got a category and a title. So we do whatever query, and now it's going to be expecting this object to have a category and a title, and that's what the paths are. Right? So that means that in this case, Next.js is going to be creating 3 HTML files using those placeholders inside those path segments. And here's a last example here. This is a catch-all, and this app/blog/square brackets ... slug. This has to be, it's expecting one or more path segments. Right. So for example, we can return the slug, since it's one or more, that means that this is no longer just a string. It needs to be an array of strings, because this can be one or more. So slug is, and we're passing it DrupalCon Singapore. So it's going to create a file at blog/DrupalCons/Singapore. It's going to be creating a file at blog/DrupalCon/Atlanta. And a file at blog/that one weird link bait about banana slugs. Right? There's only one path segment in this return, and that's fine. You don't have to have the same length of path segments when you have a catch-all. It's just, it still needs to be an array, even if there's only one entry in it. So that's how you give all of the dynamic path segments to Next.js. And this is inside this page.js file. There's more stuff in this page.js, but this is just the first thing we're going to look at. The next thing is, how do we actually render that? So now Next.js knows, like, it needs to render 3 different HTML files. It will look for the default export inside the page.js, and it's going to assume it's an async function again. It will require it to be an async function. And, actually, I'm not sure if it's required to be an async function. But anyway, it's going to look for the default export, and it needs to be a function that will render down to some React code here. And when Next.js calls DrupalCon page, this function, it's going to give it a params object that contains the particular segment that's being rendered right now. So it'll render this once where segment is equal to Singapore, once where segment is equal to Atlanta, and one was whatever, right? So that means that we can then take that path here, and probably I need to give, this is just an example async function. I want to get the node from Drupal, right? This is a magic function. It knows what to do as far as, given this particular path segment, how do I get that particular node out of Drupal? I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that's what needs to be done here. And if it can't find that in Drupal, it needs to throw this not found function, which is a function provided by Next.js to say, show a 404 page for this route. And then we're returning, this is going to be the markup, right, that gets rendered at the bottom there. So those are the 2 things that are required inside your page.js. a function that defines what all the different paths are, and then a function that renders a particular path to markup. What can go inside? Remember, this is all running on the server, right? It's not on the client. That means you can't put any client code in those React components that you're using. Inside Page.js, when you import a React component, none of those components can use client code. If we try to use, because it's not running in a web browser, if we try to use state or use effect, these hooks in React, inside a server component, the build is going to fail immediately and give you this error message that says, nope, you can't do that. So, like, all of my React code has these hooks. Use state, use effect, like 95% of my React components have those hooks in them. How do we get around that? Suspense boundaries and React rehydration is how we get around that. All we need to do is in any component that uses one of these hooks, we add this use client declaration. You remember use strict from way back in the old days of JavaScript? Some of you do. Well, you just write this as the first line in your component, use client, and React will see that and go, okay, this is a client component. I'm not gonna render it on the server. It'll read the file and go, okay, I'm gonna wait till later to when it's actually on the web browser to render this. So during the server build step, anytime it sees a client component, it will create this, it'll automatically sort of magically create this what's called a suspense boundary, which says, it's just a little placeholder in our HTML file that says there's gonna be a client component rendered here. And then it'll bundle some JavaScript, which will then render that client code when it gets to the browser. Now, I said that 95% of my components, React components, have these hooks in them. If my entire code base has these hooks, then nothing actually gets rendered on the server. How do we fix that problem? And that's because this automatic creation of this suspense boundary is nice for teeny components, but you need to use a different pattern in order to make sure that the most markup gets rendered on the server as possible. And this is a pattern that I found. We're going to have an example of an open nav button. So like, if we have this little button on our website that opens the navigation, like we want the button to be rendered inside our server-side index.html file, or the file that gets, the HTML file that gets rendered. But it's not going to be clickable until it gets to the web browser. But we still want to render that button. So we'll create a component which has 3 files in it. These are, you can name them whatever you want. This is just a convention that I've found that's useful. We're going to start with the client file. So this is the one that will be rendered in the web browser. We have to declare it as a use client. And then we can do whatever we want here. And then at the bottom here, I'm actually going to import code from the component.js. And this is where most of the markup is going to live. It's going to live in this. So these are all the like dynamic-y bits of our React JavaScript. And then the markup we want to try to stuff into this component.js file. And I'll show why in a second here. But this is just really simple. It's a button with styles, and it just takes some props. Right? But you notice there's no use client at the top here. This means when there's no use client, this means that this is a server component and can be rendered on the server. And it can be. You can see that there's no hooks in this. It's just going to render this markup. If this component gets used in the server page, this server component can render just fine. Because all the dynamic bits are in the ... props, right? And how do we weave this all together? Inside the index.js, now instead of this sort of automatic creation of a suspense boundary. We're gonna specifically create the suspense boundary and tell it how to render. So inside this suspense wrapper is the client component, because when the server sees either a client component or a suspense boundary, it's going to go, oh, this is where client code goes. I'm just going to create a little placeholder here, and then it's going to get rendered later. But when we explicitly define our suspense boundaries, we can define a fallback. And here you can see we're using that same component.js file that renders the HTML. So when this is rendered on the web browser, it does all of the dynamic React stuff from, the open button client. But when it's rendered on the server, it just renders the HTML from our component.js. And if you remember, this is also using the component.js to get the markup. So it's the same markup. You don't have to duplicate the markup. And that means that when it's rendered on the server, you get component.js, and when it's rendered on the client, it replaces that with the client version of it. This is the magic of React Server components and React Client components. We've got like 3 minutes left before we do Q&A. There is a Next Drupal project that is actually 2 parts. There's Drupal modules that you can do composer required, Drupal/next. It'll install some Drupal modules that makes it a little bit easier for content editors, and it does some implements some features of Next.js that you would want on the Drupal side. And then there's also an NPM package. This is part of this project. NPM install Drupal Next at Canary. The Canary version is the one that has the React Server components, the app router support in it. So that's how I have to install it for now until an official release comes out. I'm going to show real quickly. I took screenshots instead of doing a live demo. If you install the Drupal modules, this is the National Association of Realtors. It's using Next.js to render this website. It has the Next Drupal set of Drupal modules installed on their site. It doesn't do server components, but I want to show you how it improves the content editor experience. So this is just like loading the page for any random anonymous user can see this. When you go to the admin of it, so we're on the Drupal side now, and here's our usual view, edit, delete, whatever tabs. And normally, when you have a decoupled website, Drupal's no longer in charge of rendering the markup, so it can't show you anything in the view tab that looks anything like the site. But with the Next Drupal modules, it will create an iframe that actually loads the website with this data. So we're on the Code of Ethics node page inside the Drupal site. It's loading that same content from the actual website in an iframe. And it works with revisions. So like you can go look at the revisions tab and click on an old revision, and it'll show you the old data using the current client side, the Next.js code. So it'll render on the fly dynamically, because remember, this is old content. So it's no longer as an HTML file on the server because you have a new version that's been rebuilt and got replaced. But it'll still load that old data using Next.js and render it in an iframe when you click on that link. That's really nice. That's why I like those modules. I got like 30 seconds. So one caveat that I want to talk about is this catch-all slug. It's very common for people to want to create a ... slug in square brackets in the bottom of our app directory, right? And that means like our content editors can create whatever URL they want, and then that ... slug will just render every single page. You just like say, hey, Drupal, give me all the URLs, and then that page is in charge of rendering every single path that whatever the content defines inside Drupal, right? So Drupal defines the paths. This is how you would render it. This has a big problem because PHP imports are dynamic, meaning literally you can require a PHP file using a variable, and whatever's in that variable, it'll load that particular PHP file. This is fine. This is how Drupal works. So if a particular path requires paragraphs, it'll import the code for paragraphs and then render those paragraphs. But if a particular path does not require paragraphs, it won't include it. It doesn't need to. It can do dynamic routes. But JavaScript imports are static. So if a route needs paragraphs, it has to statically import the paragraphs. And that means if we had that catch-all route, we no longer can make the decision ahead of time, does this particular path use paragraphs or not? We have to statically include all of the components for all of the routes. That's not great. You're going to end up with a huge JavaScript. It's like all the client behaviors gets bundled together for the site for every single path. And it has no way to separate that out currently. But there's a way to get around this, and that is with Path Auto. Everybody loves Path Auto, so this is a great solution. You create, instead of one giant catch-all Next.js dynamic route, you create one Next.js dynamic route per Path Auto pattern. So if you've got /blog, whatever in your Path Auto pattern, you will create a dynamic route for that pattern. And you should also try to constrain paragraph types per field. That means that in a particular route, you'll know that, oh, that field only requires these subset of paragraphs and not the full set of paragraphs. So you can, again, limit how much JavaScript you're importing in any particular route. And then lastly, if there's a unicorn paragraph type, because there's like one page which is just weird and has some weird components on it, create a unicorn route for it. It doesn't, if you create a unicorn route next to a dynamic route, it'll work just fine because Next.js will see the statically defined, explicitly defined route and go, oh, it wants to use that one, not the catch-all route that would catch anything next to it. So that's my workarounds there. We only have a couple minutes, but thank you.